German POWs couldn't believe American girls brought them Christmas gifts wrapped in newspaper. The biting wind whipped across the desolate plains, carrying with it the ghosts of forgotten battles. It was a wind that whispered tales of hardship, of unimaginable courage, and of choices made in the crucible of war, choices that often shape destinies far beyond the battlefield's immediate scope. We stand on the precipice of such a story, a narrative woven from the threads of conflict, kindness, and the profound, often unexpected ways humanity can manifest even in its darkest hours. This is not a story of grand strategy or sweeping victories, but of the quiet moments, the unexpected gestures that reveal the true heart of a conflict. It is a story that begins with a seemingly impossible scenario, a flicker of disbelief that ignited a spark of hope in the unlikeliest of places. Imagine, if you will, the stark reality of a prisoner of war camp, a place defined by deprivation, by the gnawing absence of freedom, and by the ever-present shadow of uncertainty. Now picture a scene so incongruous with this grim existence that it strains credulity. American girls, not soldiers, not officials, but ordinary young women, arriving with gifts. Gifts not wrapped in festive paper, but in the very newsprint that chronicled the very war that held these men captive. This juxtaposition is the genesis of our exploration, a profound human paradox that demands our attention. For decades, the narrative of World War II has been dominated by tales of heroic charges, strategic maneuvers, and the stark brutality of combat. We are accustomed to seeing the war through the lens of soldiers and generals, of nations locked in ideological struggle. But the human experience of war is infinitely more complex, a tapestry woven with countless individual threads, many of which have been lost to the relentless march of time. The stories of prisoners of war, particularly those on the losing side, are often relegated to footnotes, their suffering and their resilience largely overlooked. This script seeks to unearth one such forgotten front, not on the battlefield itself, but in the spaces between the lines, in the quiet corridors of human interaction that defied the prevailing animosities. The image of German prisoners receiving gifts from American civilians, especially at Christmas, challenges our preconceived notions of wartime enmities. It raises immediate questions. How did this happen? What motivated these young women? And what was the true impact of such an act in a world consumed by conflict? This is the mystery we will unravel. A journey that will take us from the bleak landscapes of POW camps to the intimate reflections found in salvaged letters and diaries, to the broader historical and psychological forces at play. Our aim is not merely to recount an unusual event, but to delve into the deeper currents of human nature it reveals. The Second World War, while a global conflagration, was also a series of intensely personal experiences. This particular incident, the simple act of gifting wrapped in newspaper, serves as a powerful microcosm of these complexities. It forces us to confront the inherent duality of human beings, capable of immense cruelty and profound compassion, often simultaneously. The newspaper itself becomes a potent symbol, a tangible link between the propaganda and the reality, between the enemy and the potential for connection. It represents the world outside the barbed wire, a world that, for a brief moment, reached in with an act of unexpected grace. We will explore the historical context that made such an act both remarkable and perhaps inevitable. What were the prevailing attitudes towards enemy prisoners? What societal factors might have contributed to this act of benevolence? And how did the recipients themselves perceive this gesture? This documentary hybrid will not shy away from the harsh realities of war, but it will also seek out the glimmers of light that persisted, the moments that remind us that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the human spirit can find ways to connect, to empathize, and to offer solace. This journey will be guided by a commitment to historical accuracy, interwoven with a deeply empathetic narration. We will move beyond the factual recounting of events to explore the emotional resonance they hold, the moral quandaries they present, and the philosophical implications they carry. The narrative will unfold not as a dry recitation of facts, but as an immersive experience, drawing the audience into the heart of the story through vivid descriptions, poignant testimonies, and insightful analysis. The initial disbelief that greets the premise of our story, German POWs receiving Christmas gifts from American girls wrapped in newspaper, is precisely the hook that draws us in. It is a story that on its surface seems improbable, even contradictory to the prevailing narratives of the war. But it is in these contradictions, these unexpected deviations from the expected, that we often find the most profound truths about ourselves and our history. This is the essence of the docu-emotion hybrid approach, to blend the rigor of documentary filmmaking with the emotional depth of literary storytelling, creating a narrative that is both intellectually stimulating and deeply moving. The path ahead will lead us through the grim realities of internment, the psychological toll of captivity, and the complex relationships that can form even across enemy lines. We will examine the decisions made by individuals, both those who gave and those who received, and consider the ripple effects of those choices. This exploration is not merely an academic exercise, it is an invitation to reflect on our own capacity for empathy, our understanding of conflict, and the enduring power of human connection. The forgotten fronts of history are not just geographical locations, they are also the often unseen aspects of human experience that lie beneath the surface of major events. This particular story, with its peculiar blend of hardship and unexpected kindness, offers a unique window into these forgotten dimensions of the Second World War. It is a testament to the fact that history is not just written by victors and vanquished, but also by the quiet acts of humanity that transcend the boundaries of war. We embark on this journey to uncover not just what happened, but why it matters, and what lessons it still holds for us today. The narrative will build, block by block, revealing layers of context, emotion, and historical significance, all leading to a deeper understanding of this singular moment and its broader implications for the human story. The initial shock of the premise, German prisoners of war receiving Christmas gifts from American girls with the gifts wrapped in newspaper, is designed to pique immediate curiosity. It's a scenario that seems to defy the brutal realities of World War II, a moment of apparent incongruity in a conflict defined by deep-seated animosity. This unexpected juxtaposition is the entry point into a narrative that seeks to explore the complexities of human interaction under extreme duress. It's a story that doesn't fit neatly into the traditional war narratives of heroes and villains, of decisive battles and grand strategies. Instead, it delves into the quieter, more personal dimensions of conflict, focusing on the individual choices and the unexpected acts of kindness that can emerge even in the most hostile environments. The very act of using newspaper to wrap gifts immediately suggests a scarcity of resources, a wartime constraint, but also a resourceful ingenuity, and perhaps a subtle, almost accidental commentary on the ephemeral nature of news and propaganda, compared to the enduring value of human connection. This particular script aims to investigate the circumstances surrounding these events, moving beyond the initial anecdotal observation to uncover the historical context, the motivations of those involved, and the profound impact on the recipients. We will explore the psychological landscape of a POW camp, a place where time often stretches into an eternity of waiting, where the absence of freedom is a constant, palpable presence, and where the future is a landscape shrouded in uncertainty. Into this bleak existence, a gesture of goodwill arrives, not from official channels, but from ordinary civilians, a group of young women. The use of newspaper for wrapping is particularly striking. It's a material that carries the weight of the very conflict that has imprisoned these men, a constant reminder of the world outside that is both their captor and, in this instance, their unexpected benefactor. This detail is not merely a practical consideration, it's a potent symbol that we will explore throughout our narrative, a tangible link between the war and the humanity that persists despite it. The objective is to craft a narrative that is both historically grounded and emotionally resonant, a docu-emotion hybrid that uses literary and documentary techniques to bring this forgotten front to life. The tone will be solemn, empathetic, and investigative, aiming to create a sense of intimacy with the subjects while maintaining the rigor of historical inquiry. We are not just recounting an event, we are seeking to understand the human decisions that led to it, the moral dilemmas faced by those involved, and the enduring legacy of such acts of compassion. The narrative will unfold organically, revealing new layers of information and emotional depth with each passing segment, prompting reflection on themes of conflict, empathy, and the resilience of the human spirit. The initial premise serves as a powerful hook, drawing the audience into a story that promises to challenge their assumptions and offer a unique perspective on the Second World War. This is an invitation to look beyond the headlines and the battlefield, to the heart of human experience, where even in the darkest of times, flickers of light can emerge in the most unexpected ways. The story begins with a seemingly simple yet profoundly disarming image. German prisoners of war, confined behind barbed wire, their faces etched with the weariness of captivity, receiving Christmas gifts. What makes this scene extraordinary is not just the act of receiving gifts, but the nature of those gifts and their presentation. They were brought by American girls, young women from the very nation that held them captive, and more remarkably, they were wrapped in newspaper. This detail, the newspaper wrapping, is crucial. It speaks of scarcity, of wartime constraints, but also of a resourceful, perhaps even poignant attempt to bring a semblance of normalcy and festive cheer to those stripped of so much. It's an image that challenges the stark, often one-dimensional portrayals of wartime animosity, suggesting a more complex reality where human connection could, however fleetingly, bridge the chasms of conflict. This is the genesis of our exploration, a quiet anomaly in the grand narrative of the Second World War, a forgotten front that reveals something profound about the human condition. We will delve into this peculiar moment, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a window into the intricate tapestry of human emotions and decisions that defined the war. The very improbability of the scene, American girls, ordinary civilians, extending a gesture of kindness to enemy combatants, demands investigation. What societal forces were at play? What were the prevailing attitudes towards prisoners of war, and how did this specific act deviate from, or perhaps subtly reflect those attitudes? The newspaper wrapping itself becomes a symbol, a tangible link to the outside world. A world that for these men was both distant and the source of their current predicament. It's a detail that suggests resourcefulness, perhaps even a touch of irony, in the use of the very medium that chronicled the conflict that brought them here. This specific, almost mundane detail serves as our initial hook, drawing us into a narrative that promises to be rich in historical context and emotional depth. Our journey will trace the origins of this gesture, exploring the motivations of the young women who participated and the circumstances that allowed such an event to occur. We will look beyond the broad strokes of historical accounts to uncover the personal stories, the individual choices, and the moral considerations that underpinned this unusual act of outreach. The narrative will be framed within the broader context of the Second World War, acknowledging the immense suffering and brutality of the conflict, but intentionally seeking out those moments that highlight the enduring capacity for compassion and empathy. This is the core of the docu-emotion hybrid approach, to blend factual historical analysis with a deeply human and empathetic narration, creating a story that is both informative and emotionally engaging. We aim to evoke a sense of solemnity and reflection, prompting the audience to consider not just what happened, but why it matters and what it reveals about the complexities of human nature during wartime. The introduction of this story is designed to immediately establish its unique angle. It's not about a major battle or a strategic turning point, but about a subtle, deeply human interaction that occurred on a forgotten front, the front of human decency amidst overwhelming animosity. The newspaper-wrapped gifts serve as a potent, almost poetic symbol of this intersection of conflict and kindness. This script will explore the historical reality behind this image, using it as a springboard to examine themes of moral decision-making, the psychological impact of war on both captors and captives, and the ways in which seemingly small acts can carry immense significance. We will navigate through archival evidence, personal testimonies, and historical analysis to construct a compelling narrative that underscores the enduring power of empathy, even in the face of profound division. The initial disbelief that the premise might inspire is precisely what we aim to harness, drawing the audience into a story that promises to be both surprising and deeply moving, revealing a facet of the war that has largely been overlooked. The biting wind across the desolate plains carried with it more than just the chill of winter. It carried the whispers of forgotten stories, tales etched into the very fabric of history that often go unheard. Among these narratives lies a peculiar confluence of hardship and unexpected human connection, a story so incongruous with the brutal realities of the Second World War that it initially strains credulity. Imagine for a moment the stark, bleak existence within a German prisoner of war camp, the gnawing hunger, the constant chill, the crushing weight of lost freedom, and the ever-present uncertainty of what the future held. Now introduce a scene that seems to defy this grim reality. A group of American girls, not soldiers, not officials, but ordinary young women, arriving with gifts. And not just any gifts, but presents wrapped not in festive paper, but in the very newsprint that chronicled the war that had brought these men to this desolate place. This is the genesis of our investigation, a paradox that demands our attention, a moment where the lines between enemy and fellow human began to blur in the most unexpected of ways. This particular incident, the image of German POWs receiving Christmas gifts wrapped in newspaper from American girls, serves as our initial hook, a seemingly small anomaly that opens a gateway into a much larger, more complex narrative. It challenges the conventional understanding of wartime enmities, prompting immediate questions about how and why such an event could transpire. The Second World War is often remembered through the lens of grand battles, strategic maneuvers, and ideological struggles. Yet the human experience of war is far richer and more nuanced, woven from countless individual threads, many of which have been lost to the relentless passage of time. This script seeks to unearth one such forgotten front, not on the battlefield itself, but in the quiet, often overlooked spaces of human interaction that defied the prevailing animosities. The very act of using newspaper for wrapping speaks volumes. It signifies a scarcity of resources, a wartime constraint, but also a resourceful, perhaps even poignant, ingenuity. It's a tangible link to the outside world, the very world that had imprisoned these men, now offering a gesture of unexpected grace. Our exploration will delve into the historical context that made such an act both remarkable and, perhaps, a subtle reflection of underlying currents. What were the prevailing attitudes towards enemy prisoners? What societal factors might have contributed to this act of civilian benevolence? And most importantly, how did the recipients themselves perceive this gesture, a gesture that arrived wrapped in the very paper that reported on their nation's struggle? This documentary hybrid aims to blend historical fact with emotional depth, using a solemn, empathetic and investigative tone to bring this story to life. We will move beyond mere recounting to explore the moral quandaries, the psychological impacts, and the philosophical implications of such moments. The newspaper, a silent witness to the unfolding conflict, becomes a potent symbol, a testament to the fact that even in the most challenging of circumstances, humanity can find ways to connect, to empathize, and to offer solace. This is not just a story about a forgotten event. It is a story about the enduring power of human spirit, about the choices we make when faced with adversity, and about the lessons that history, in its quietest moments, can teach us. We embark on this journey to understand not only what happened, but why it resonates and what it reveals about the complex, often contradictory, nature of human beings caught in the crucible of war. The stark reality of captivity often breeds a peculiar form of resilience, a mental fortitude forged in the crucible of deprivation. For these German prisoners, Christmas in an American camp was an experience far removed from the festive imagery of home. The newspaper wrapping, initially a symbol of scarcity, also served as a conduit for information, albeit fragmented and often biased. Each folded sheet contained headlines that spoke of battles raging, of shifting fronts, and of the relentless propaganda machine that characterized the war. For the men behind the wire, these papers were a lifeline, a tangible connection to the world they had lost, even as they reported on the conflict that had imprisoned them. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where information is scarce, yet critical for understanding your circumstances. The prisoners, driven by an innate human need to comprehend their reality, meticulously unfolded these papers, piecing together fragments of news, searching for any hint of their nation's progress or the potential for their own release. This act of information gathering, born of desperation, also fostered a unique kind of camaraderie among them. They would share these scraps of news, discussing potential implications, debating the veracity of reports, and collectively trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to forget them. Furthermore, the psychological impact of such a gesture, however small, cannot be overstated. Receiving gifts, especially during a holiday associated with family and warmth, served as a potent reminder of a humanity that extended beyond the confines of war. The American girls, in their youthful innocence and perhaps a nascent understanding of shared humanity, inadvertently provided a crucial emotional balm. They did not see just the enemy. They saw individuals, men who, like their own brothers or fathers, might be experiencing hardship and longing for connection. This perspective, so different from the dehumanizing rhetoric of wartime propaganda, created a cognitive dissonance for the prisoners. They were the enemy, yet they were being treated with a degree of kindness. This internal conflict, this dissonance, was itself a catalyst for reflection. It forced them to confront their own preconceptions and perhaps to question the narratives they had been fed about their adversaries. Building on this, however, the very act of receiving gifts wrapped in newspaper carried a subtle, almost ironic, commentary on the ephemeral nature of conflict and information. The headlines of today's victory could be tomorrow's forgotten news, overshadowed by new developments and shifting tides of war. The newspaper, a medium designed to capture the present moment, became a symbol of the transient nature of their imprisonment and the war itself. For the prisoners, these papers were not just sources of information. They were artifacts, physical remnants of a world in flux, a world they desperately wished to rejoin. The stories printed on those pages spoke of grand strategies and geopolitical shifts, but for the men in the camp, the most profound revelation lay in the simple act of the paper being folded around a small token of goodwill. It was a testament to the fact that even amidst the grand narratives of war, individual actions and human connections could carve out their own significant space, offering a different kind of truth, one rooted in empathy rather than ideology. Consequently, the shared experience of deciphering these newspaper-wrapped gifts fostered a unique micro-society within the POW camp. The act of unwrapping became a ritual, a moment of collective anticipation and shared experience that momentarily eclipsed the harsh realities of their confinement. It provided a focal point for interaction, a reason to gather and communicate, breaking the monotony and isolation that often characterized prisoner life. Now consider how this applies when you face a challenging group dynamic. Finding common ground, even in mundane activities, can be a powerful tool for fostering cohesion and shared purpose. These simple gifts, presented in such an unconventional manner, became more than just objects. They became catalysts for conversation, for shared memories, and for a renewed, albeit fragile, sense of connection to the world outside. The newspaper, in its unassuming presence, became a silent narrator of this complex interplay between conflict, information, and the enduring human desire for recognition and kindness. The intricate dance between propaganda and personal experience within the POW camp offered a fertile ground for a nuanced understanding of wartime perceptions. While the newspaper headlines might have painted a picture of unwavering nationalistic fervor and absolute moral righteousness on the part of the Allied forces, the tangible reality of the gifts, however humble, introduced a discordant note. This dissonance compelled the prisoners to engage in a more critical evaluation of the information they consumed. Now consider how this applies when you encounter information that seems to contradict your deeply held beliefs. A critical examination of the source and its underlying motivations becomes paramount. They began to dissect not just the war news, but the very act of giving itself. Was it a strategic maneuver, a calculated attempt to sow discord or gain favor, or was it a genuine expression of empathy, a spontaneous act of human kindness that transcended the political machinations of war? This internal debate, this wrestling with conflicting interpretations, was a profoundly intellectual and emotional exercise, forcing them to look beyond the surface-level narratives and confront the complexities of human behavior. Furthermore, this period within the camps saw the emergence of a unique form of informal historical analysis among the prisoners. They became keen observers of not only the news, but also the subtle shifts in the demeanor of their captors, the routines of the guards, and the occasional interactions with civilians like the young women who brought the gifts. They started to construct their own parallel narratives, trying to reconcile the official pronouncements with the lived experiences. This process wasn't about deciphering military secrets. It was about understanding the human element of the war, the motivations and emotions that drove both sides. Building on this, however, the newspaper itself, beyond its news content, became a canvas for their own unspoken narratives. Some prisoners, perhaps finding solace in creative expression, might have used the margins to sketch, to write poetry, or to record their own thoughts and observations, essentially creating their own counter-narratives on the very medium that disseminated the official one. Conversely, the psychological impact of these gifts extended beyond mere momentary comfort. For men stripped of their identity, their purpose, and their autonomy, such gestures, however wrapped, served as a powerful affirmation of their continued existence as individuals. It was a stark contrast to the abstract dehumanization that war often entailed. Now consider how this applies when you feel overlooked or marginalized. A simple acknowledgement of your presence and worth can have a profound restorative effect. The newspaper, with its impersonal print, was ultimately superseded by the personal touch of the wrapping, the thought behind the gift, and the implied recognition of their shared humanity. This subtle yet significant shift in perception could foster a fragile sense of hope, a belief that perhaps the world beyond the barbed wire had not entirely forgotten them, and that the inherent goodness of some individuals could, however briefly, eclipse the pervasive darkness of war. This internal recalibration, this recalibration of hope, was perhaps as significant as any military intelligence they might have gleaned from the newsprint. The profound psychological impact of the newspaper-wrapped gifts extended beyond the immediate gratification of receiving something tangible. For men accustomed to a rigid, often dehumanizing military structure, the very informality of the presentation, gifts tucked into everyday newsprint, subtly undermined the stark dichotomy between captor and captive. It suggested a less formal, perhaps more personal interaction occurring outside the rigid lines of official engagement. This nuance allowed for a re-evaluation of the enemy. 2. Instead of a monolithic, faceless entity, the opposing force began to resolve into individuals, some of whom, like these young women, were capable of gestures that defied the logic of total war. Now consider how this applies when you encounter individuals whose actions seem to contradict the prevailing narrative about their group. It prompts a more nuanced and less generalized understanding. This wasn't about condoning the war, but about recognizing that human behavior within its confines was rarely monolithic. The newspaper, in this context, became a de facto cultural artifact, offering glimpses into the daily lives and values of the people on the other side of the conflict, a stark contrast to the often abstract geopolitical pronouncements that dominated their wartime information diet. Furthermore, the specific content within these newspaper wrappers, beyond the war news, offered a unique anthropological insight. Imagine reading about local bake sales, community events, or even advertisements for everyday goods. These details, seemingly mundane, painted a picture of a society continuing to function, to find joy in small things, and to maintain a semblance of normalcy even amidst a global conflict. For prisoners who had been abruptly removed from their own societal contexts, these glimpses were incredibly potent. They provided a different kind of information, one that spoke to shared human experiences and desires, irrespective of nationality or wartime allegiance. Building on this, however, the very act of unwrapping these papers could become a shared intellectual exercise. Prisoners might have pooled their linguistic skills, with those proficient in English deciphering articles, explaining cultural references, and translating advertisements, fostering a collaborative learning environment that transcended their immediate circumstances and offered a mental escape from the drudgery of camp life. Conversely, the strategic implications of such civilian gestures, while perhaps unintentional, were not entirely lost on the broader wartime intelligence apparatus. While the primary focus might have been on military intelligence, the circulation of such stories, even anecdotally, could have served as a subtle indicator of public sentiment and morale on the home front. It suggested a civilian population actively, if unconventionally, engaging with the human dimension of the war rather than solely focusing on the abstract notions of victory or defeat. Now consider how this applies when you observe seemingly small social trends. They can sometimes foreshadow larger shifts in public opinion or societal values. The newspaper, therefore, acted as a dual-purpose medium. For the prisoners, it was a source of news and unexpected connection. For potential observers, it represented a subtle barometer of civilian engagement with the war's human cost, a testament to the fact that the war's impact was felt and responded to in multifaceted ways, far beyond the battlefield. This layer of interpretation adds another dimension to the significance of the newspaper as more than just a wrapping material. It becomes a document of human interaction within the broader conflict. The prisoners' engagement with the newspaper extended beyond mere news consumption. It became a tactile and intellectual exploration of their captors' culture. Imagine a prisoner meticulously tracing the advertisements, not just for product names, but for the underlying societal values they represented. The emphasis on consumerism, family life, and leisure activities. These seemingly trivial details offered a profound counterpoint to the brutal efficiency of wartime industry and the constant threat of death. Now consider how this applies when you are trying to understand a different culture. Observing everyday advertisements can reveal much about their priorities and aspirations. This wasn't about understanding military strategy, but about grasping the fabric of everyday life in the enemy nation. A life that continued, in many ways, uninterrupted by the global conflict. This nuanced understanding chipped away at the monolithic portrayal of the enemy and fostered a more complex, humanized view of the world outside their wire. Furthermore, the very act of unwrapping the gifts could have fostered a unique form of communal learning and shared anticipation. Picture prisoners with varying levels of English proficiency collaborating to decipher the newspaper's contents. A soldier who had worked in a printing press before the war might have recognized certain typesetting styles, offering insights into the publication's origin or potential bias. Another, with a background in retail, might have been able to interpret the advertisements with greater clarity, explaining the appeal of certain products to the American consumer. Building on this, however, the shared anticipation of what lay beneath the newsprint transformed the mundane act of unwrapping into a small, controlled ritual. It was a moment where collective curiosity and shared effort momentarily superseded individual despair, creating a pocket of shared experience that was vital for maintaining morale. Conversely, the newspaper itself, as a medium, provided a stark contrast to the immediate, often brutal physical reality of the camp. The printed word, with its structured columns and reasoned arguments, even within propaganda, represented a different form of engagement with the world, one based on intellect and discourse rather than brute force. For men who had been reduced to a status of mere numbers or enemy combatants, the opportunity to engage with printed ideas, however filtered, was a powerful affirmation of their cognitive abilities and their humanity. Now consider how this applies when you are in a situation where your agency is limited. Engaging with intellectual challenges can be a powerful way to reclaim a sense of control and self-worth. The newspaper, in this sense, was not just a wrapper. It was a portal to a world of ideas, a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding persisted. This intellectual engagement provided a crucial counterpoint to the physical hardships, offering a mental escape and a way to process their experiences through a lens of reasoned thought, however difficult that might have been. The prisoner's interaction with the newspaper went beyond simply absorbing information. It became a subtle exercise in cultural decoding. They weren't just reading about troop movements or political pronouncements. They were dissecting advertisements for household goods, analyzing the visual language of product placement, and even trying to understand the social cues embedded in the classified sections. This deep dive into the minutiae of American daily life offered them a perspective on the enemy nation that was far removed from the battlefield. It revealed a society preoccupied with domesticity, consumerism, and leisure, a stark contrast to the martial focus that defined their own immediate existence. Now, consider how this applies when you are trying to understand a different societal mindset. Observing their advertisements and lifestyle features can reveal deeply ingrained cultural values and priorities. This granular level of cultural observation allowed them to build a more complex, humanized portrait of the people on the other side of the conflict, moving beyond the abstract notion of the enemy to recognize shared aspirations for comfort, security, and even simple enjoyment. Furthermore, the very texture and scent of the newsprint itself, when juxtaposed with the harsh, often sterile environment of the camp, created a sensory experience that was deeply evocative. The slightly rough paper, the faint smell of ink, and the crispness of the folded pages served as a tangible connection to the outside world, a world brimming with activity and normalcy. This sensory engagement was not merely passive, it actively stimulated their cognitive processes, prompting them to recall similar textures and smells from their former lives, thus triggering memories and emotions that offered a temporary respite from their present reality. Building on this, however, the different sections of the newspaper often featured varied paper quality or print styles, allowing prisoners with specific pre-war professions, perhaps printers, typesetters, or even bookbinders, to offer unique interpretations or identify subtle clues about the publication's origin and intended audience, adding another layer to their collective analysis. Conversely, the act of unwrapping these gifts, surrounded by fellow prisoners, fostered a unique form of collaborative interpretation. Beyond just understanding the news, they engaged in a collective effort to decipher the cultural context of the advertisements, the social implications of the classified ads, and even the subtle humor or irony present in some of the articles. This shared intellectual endeavor created a sense of shared purpose and mutual reliance, strengthening their bonds and providing a much-needed mental stimulation. Now consider how this applies when you are faced with a complex problem in a team setting. Pooling diverse knowledge and perspectives often leads to more comprehensive solutions. The newspaper, in this context, transformed from a mere source of information into a shared text, a common ground for discussion and intellectual engagement that helped to mitigate the psychological toll of their confinement. This collaborative deciphering allowed them to construct a more nuanced and multifaceted understanding of American society, one that acknowledged its complexities and contradictions, moving beyond simplistic enemy stereotypes. The prisoners' engagement with the newspaper extended beyond deciphering headlines. It became an unintentional study in cultural semiotics. They began to analyze not just the words, but the visual cues, the style of photography, the placement of advertisements, the very font choices. A particular advertisement for a household appliance, for instance, might reveal assumptions about family roles and domestic labor in American society, offering a window into societal norms far removed from the battlefield. Now, consider how this applies when you are trying to understand a different cultural context through its media. Observing the visual language and recurring themes can unlock deeper societal values. These visual elements, often overlooked by casual readers, became data points for the prisoners, allowing them to construct a more nuanced understanding of their adversaries' daily lives and priorities, suggesting a society deeply invested in comfort, convenience, and the construction of idealized domesticity, even as their nation waged a global war. Furthermore, the specific types of articles that garnered the most attention often revealed surprising commonalities. Beyond war reports, pieces discussing local sports teams, gardening tips, or even human interest stories about everyday challenges and triumphs resonated deeply. These articles, presented in the same newsprint that detailed the conflict, highlighted the persistent human desire for normalcy and connection, irrespective of nationality. Building on this, however, some prisoners might have found specific interest in the classified ads, not for potential post-war employment, but as a microcosm of societal needs and desires. A recurring ad for tutors, for instance, might suggest a societal emphasis on education, while ads for used cars could point to a culture deeply reliant on personal mobility and independence, offering insights into the infrastructure and lifestyle of the nation they were at war with. Conversely, the very act of sharing and discussing these newspaper fragments fostered a unique form of intellectual discourse within the camps. Prisoners with diverse backgrounds and pre-war professions would pool their knowledge to interpret the information, A former journalist might analyze the tone and potential bias of an editorial, while an engineer might ponder the implications of an advertisement for a new industrial product. This collaborative interpretation transformed the passive consumption of news into an active process of critical thinking and shared learning. Now, consider how this applies when you are part of a study group. Diverse perspectives enrich the understanding of complex material. The newspaper, therefore, served not only as a source of information about the war, but also as a catalyst for intellectual engagement, providing a mental exercise that helped to stave off the psychological effects of prolonged confinement and reinforce their cognitive faculties. This shared intellectual pursuit offered a sense of agency and purpose, a subtle defiance against the dehumanizing aspects of their captivity. The prisoner's gaze, scanning the newspaper pages, began to discern patterns beyond mere newsprint. They noticed the recurring imagery in advertisements, idealized families, gleaming appliances, and aspirational lifestyles, and started to infer a societal emphasis on material comfort and the nuclear family unit as cornerstones of American identity. This wasn't simply about recognizing products, it was about understanding the aspirational landscape of their adversaries. Now consider how this applies when you observe the pervasive advertising in your own society. What underlying values and aspirations does it reflect about your own culture? They began to hypothesize that a society that so heavily promoted such domestic ideals might possess a deeply ingrained aversion to the disruptive chaos of war, even if their nation was actively engaged in it. This provided a subtle counter-narrative to the aggressive rhetoric of wartime propaganda, suggesting an underlying desire for peace and stability that coexisted with the demands of conflict. Furthermore, the very layout and design of the newspapers offered clues about information hierarchy and public interest. The prominence of certain sections, the front-page war reports versus the more subdued lifestyle or entertainment sections, indicated a societal balancing act, acknowledging the gravity of the war while simultaneously striving to maintain a semblance of normalcy and engagement with civilian life. Building on this, however, the prisoners, through their collective observation, might have started to identify regional differences in advertising styles or local news coverage, suggesting a decentralized media landscape that catered to diverse community interests, a stark contrast to the more centralized propaganda efforts they were accustomed to. This granular analysis of media presentation allowed them to perceive the American society not as a monolithic entity, but as a collection of diverse communities with varying priorities and concerns, each contributing to the larger national narrative in its own way. Conversely, the subtle nuances in the language used in opinion pieces and editorials, even within the context of wartime patriotism, began to reveal a spectrum of thought. They could discern arguments that, while supporting the war effort, might have subtly questioned specific strategies or highlighted the human cost of conflict. These were not outright dissent, but rather cautious explorations of ethical considerations or pragmatic concerns that hinted at a more complex public discourse than the simplistic us versus them narrative. Now consider how this applies when you encounter nuanced arguments within a seemingly unified public stance. It often reveals deeper societal debates and underlying concerns. The newspaper, in this light, became a document not just of events, but of evolving public consciousness, a testament to the fact that even in times of intense national mobilization, critical thinking and a consideration of moral complexities could persist, offering a more humanized and less ideologically rigid understanding of the opposing nation. This deeper analysis of public discourse allowed for a more sophisticated understanding of the societal pressures and internal dialogues occurring within the enemy nation. The prisoner's scrutiny of the newspaper extended beyond overt news and advertisements to the subtle nuances of its physical form. The varying paper weights, the distinct ink smells from different printing processes, and even the presence of small printing errors or smudges offered a tangible, almost tactile connection to the manufacturing process. A prisoner who had worked in a print shop before the war might have been able to identify the type of press used, inferring the scale of the publication and its likely distribution network. This granular focus on the physical medium allowed them to appreciate the industrial machinery and human labor underpinning the dissemination of information, providing a different lens through which to view the enemy's societal infrastructure. Now, consider how this applies when you examine the physical artifacts of a different era. Their material composition can reveal much about technological capabilities and labor practices of the time. This appreciation for the physical object, the newspaper itself, added another layer to their understanding, moving beyond the content to the very means of its creation and distribution, suggesting a society with sophisticated industrial capacity dedicated not just to war, but to the widespread communication of its narratives. Furthermore, the classified advertisements, often overlooked in their immediate context, provided a surprisingly rich vein of socio-economic data. Beyond simple listings, the types of services and goods being advertised offered insights into prevailing economic conditions and consumer demands. For instance, a proliferation of ads for repair services might indicate a society prioritizing resourcefulness and longevity in consumer goods due to wartime austerity, or conversely, a booming repair market suggesting a high volume of goods in circulation. Building on this, however, the language used in these classifieds, the brevity, the specific jargon, the implied target audience, offered a unique linguistic dataset. Prisoners could analyze the economic stratification implied by different types of listings, from high-end service advertisements to more basic needs, painting a picture of a tiered economy where wartime pressures were experienced differently across various social strata. This detailed examination provided a more textured understanding of the economic landscape than any broad wartime economic report could offer. Conversely, the prisoners also began to notice the subtle evolution of newspaper content over time if they received papers spanning several weeks or months. A shift in the prominence of war-related stories, a change in the tone of editorials, or the introduction of new advertising categories could all signal underlying societal shifts or adaptations to the prolonged conflict. For instance, an increase in advertisements for home gardening supplies might reflect a governmental push for self-sufficiency or a growing public awareness of potential food shortages. Now consider how this applies when you observe long-term trends in public discourse or media consumption. They often reflect deeper societal adaptations and evolving priorities. This temporal analysis of the newspaper's content allowed the prisoners to perceive the war not as a static event, but as a dynamic process to which society was continuously adapting, revealing a degree of societal fluidity and responsiveness that complicated the simple narrative of a monolithic wartime state. This longitudinal perspective offered a more sophisticated understanding of how civilian life, even under the duress of total war, was capable of subtle yet significant transformations. The prisoner's analytical approach to the newspaper evolved to encompass the very paper's physical properties as indicators of societal priorities. They observed how the quality of paper might fluctuate, with certain editions perhaps using thinner, less durable stock, suggesting wartime material shortages impacting even the production of newsprint. This tangible evidence of resource allocation provided a grounded understanding of the war's economic impact, far more visceral than abstract casualty figures. Now consider how this applies when you examine the physical materials used in historical documents. Their condition can reveal much about the economic and technological constraints of the time. This detailed observation allowed them to infer that even the seemingly mundane act of producing a newspaper was subject to the wartime economy, indicating that resources were being diverted to the war effort and that civilian consumption, including news, was being impacted by these larger strategic decisions. Furthermore, the prisoners began to categorize the types of advertisements that appeared with greater frequency or prominence. Beyond the obvious consumer goods, they noted advertisements related to war bonds, civil defense efforts, and recruitment drives. The visual language and persuasive tactics employed in these ads offered insights into the psychological strategies being used to maintain public morale and support for the war effort. Building on this, however, they also observed the subtle integration of patriotic themes even into non-war-related advertisements. A company selling soap might feature imagery of smiling soldiers or a flag in the background, demonstrating how civilian commerce was being co-opted to reinforce nationalistic sentiment and connect everyday products with the broader war narrative, suggesting a comprehensive societal mobilization that permeated all aspects of public life. Conversely, the prisoners' collective analysis of the newspaper content sometimes led to unexpected moments of shared reflection on universal human experiences. Articles about family reunions, the challenges of raising children during wartime, or the simple joys of a community gathering, even when presented within a foreign cultural context, resonated with their own memories and longings. These shared moments of empathetic connection, prompted by secular content, served as a powerful counterpoint to the divisive rhetoric of war. Now consider how this applies when you encounter stories of common human struggles or joys, regardless of their origin. They often highlight our shared humanity. The newspaper in these instances transcended its role as a source of enemy information and became a conduit for recognizing fundamental human experiences, fostering a subtle, albeit indirect, sense of shared humanity that momentarily bridged the chasm of conflict and offered a different perspective on the nature of the enemy. This shared understanding of universal human themes provided a critical humanizing element to their analysis, reminding them of the common ground that persisted despite the ongoing hostilities. The prisoners' engagement with the newspaper extended beyond mere textual analysis, delving into the subtle yet pervasive influence of visual culture. They began to dissect the advertisements not just for their product offerings, but for the underlying archetypes and narratives they projected. The ubiquitous presence of smiling, often idealized families in advertisements for everything from breakfast cereal to automobiles suggested a societal ideal that was deeply rooted in domestic harmony and material aspiration. This visual language, consistently reinforced across various publications, offered a powerful, albeit indirect, commentary on what was considered a desirable and successful life in wartime America. Now consider how this applies when you observe recurring visual motifs in modern advertising. They often reveal deeply embedded cultural values and aspirations. For the prisoners, this visual bombardment presented a fascinating paradox. A nation at war, engaged in immense destruction, simultaneously projecting an image of idyllic domesticity and consumer abundance. This dissonance prompted contemplation on how a society could reconcile such seemingly opposing realities, suggesting a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization or a sophisticated manipulation of imagery to maintain civilian morale. Furthermore, the prisoners observed the changing nature of visual content over time, noting how certain imagery became more or less prominent. An initial focus on patriotic symbols and military achievements might gradually give way to advertisements emphasizing resilience, community support, or even escapism through entertainment. This temporal analysis of visual trends provided a dynamic understanding of how societal messaging adapted to the evolving realities of a protracted conflict. Building on this, however, a keen observer might have noticed subtle shifts in the portrayal of women in advertisements. Initially depicted in more traditional domestic roles, their imagery might have evolved to reflect the increasing participation of women in the wartime workforce, subtly mirroring societal changes and the redefinition of gender roles under the exigencies of war, offering a visual timeline of social adaptation. Conversely, the prisoner's interpretation of these visual narratives was not monolithic. Different individuals, drawing on their own pre-war experiences and cultural backgrounds, would interpret the same advertisements through distinct lenses. A former artist might focus on composition and color theory, while a sociologist might analyze the implied social hierarchies and class distinctions. This diversity of interpretation, facilitated by shared viewing and discussion of the newspaper pages, enriched their collective understanding, transforming the act of looking at advertisements into a nuanced form of cultural critique and comparative analysis. Now consider how this applies when you engage in group discussions about media. Diverse perspectives can uncover layers of meaning that might otherwise remain hidden. The visual language of the newspaper, therefore, became a rich source of information, not just about products, but about the psychological landscape, societal ideals, and adaptive strategies of the nation they were at war with, revealing a complex interplay between wartime realities and the persistent pursuit of normalcy and aspiration. The prisoner's keen observation of the newspaper extended to the subtle ways in which societal anxieties were subtly addressed or, conversely, masked. Advertisements for security systems or insurance policies, for instance, though seemingly mundane, could be interpreted as indicators of underlying societal concerns about crime or financial instability, anxieties that might be amplified by the pressures of wartime. Now consider how this applies when you notice recurring themes in public service announcements. They often reveal underlying societal worries or areas requiring public attention. These advertisements, placed alongside articles about military progress or national unity, created a layered narrative, suggesting that even amidst a unified war effort, the everyday concerns of citizens persisted and were being catered to by the commercial sector. This provided a more nuanced picture of the home front, one that acknowledged both the collective drive towards victory and the individual preoccupations that continued to shape daily life. Furthermore, the prisoners began to analyze the frequency and placement of different types of articles and advertisements as a form of media economics. They understood that advertisers paid for prime placement, and that the editors decided what constituted front-page news versus filler content. This understanding allowed them to infer what the newspaper's publishers and advertisers deemed most important or most likely to capture reader attention. Building on this, however, they might have noticed a deliberate downplaying of certain negative news, such as rising inflation or significant civilian casualties from distant bombings, in favor of more uplifting or patriotic content, suggesting a conscious editorial decision to manage public perception and maintain morale, a practice that revealed the media's role not just as an informer, but as an active participant in shaping the national narrative. Conversely, the prisoners' discussions sometimes turned to the ethical implications of consuming information produced by an enemy nation. While intellectually stimulating, the act of dissecting American society through its own media raised questions about complicity, or at least passive engagement, with the enemy's propaganda. This internal moral debate, occurring in hushed tones within the confines of the camp, highlighted the complex psychological landscape of captivity. Now consider how this applies when you are exposed to information that challenges your deeply held convictions. It often prompts a period of introspection and ethical consideration. The newspaper, in this context, became not just a source of external information, but a catalyst for internal ethical reflection, forcing them to grapple with the moral ambiguities of their situation and their own role in processing information that originated from the very forces that held them captive. This ethical dimension added a significant layer to their analysis, revealing that their engagement with the newspaper was not purely an intellectual exercise, but also a deeply personal and morally charged one. The prisoners' interaction with the newspaper evolved into an exercise in dissecting the subtle undercurrents of wartime social policy as reflected in public announcements and classified sections. Beyond the overt war news, they began to identify recurring notices pertaining to rationing, salvage drives, and volunteer recruitment for auxiliary services. These weren't merely civic duties, they represented a national mobilization strategy, an attempt to integrate the civilian populace into the war effort by fostering a sense of shared responsibility and contribution. Now consider how this applies when you observe widespread public campaigns for specific causes. They often reveal underlying societal priorities and governmental strategies for collective action. The consistent presence of these announcements suggested a deliberate effort to cultivate a citizenry actively engaged in the war, not just as passive observers, but as participants in its logistical and material support. This detailed analysis allowed them to understand the war not just as a military conflict, but as a total societal undertaking that permeated civilian life. Furthermore, the prisoners noticed how the language used in these public service announcements often employed a carefully calibrated blend of urgency and reassurance. Phrases emphasizing sacrifices for victory were frequently paired with assurances of eventual triumph and the protection of democratic ideals. This rhetorical strategy aimed to motivate citizens by appealing to both their sense of duty and their hope for a better future. Building on this, however, they might have observed how specific demographic groups were targeted with tailored messages. For instance, announcements appealing to women for volunteer work might emphasize their crucial role in supporting the troops or maintaining home front stability, while messages aimed at younger men, if not eligible for direct combat, might focus on industrial production or essential services, revealing a sophisticated understanding of demographic segmentation in wartime messaging. Conversely, the prisoners began to interpret the absence of certain topics in the newspapers as equally significant to their presence. A noticeable lack of detailed reporting on civilian casualties from enemy bombings, or a consistent downplaying of the economic hardships faced by certain segments of the population, suggested a deliberate editorial policy aimed at managing public perception and preventing widespread demoralization. Now consider how this applies when you notice what isn't being discussed in public forums. The silences can often be as revealing as the pronouncements. This selective reporting, this curation of information, indicated a conscious effort to maintain a narrative of progress and resilience, even in the face of significant challenges. The newspaper, therefore, became a document not only of what was communicated, but also of what was deliberately omitted, offering insights into the strategic communication efforts designed to shape public opinion and sustain national morale throughout the protracted conflict. This critical examination of omissions allowed for a more comprehensive understanding of the information control mechanisms at play. The prisoners' analysis of the newspaper content evolved to include a critical examination of the implied audience for various articles and advertisements. They began to infer that certain sections, particularly those detailing consumer goods or leisure activities, were likely targeted at a civilian populace seeking a respite from wartime anxieties, aiming to reinforce a sense of normalcy and continued prosperity. Conversely, articles focusing on industrial output or technological advancements in military hardware were clearly directed at a more informed, perhaps even nationalistic segment of the population, designed to instill confidence in the war machine. Now consider how this applies when you encounter different forms of media. Understanding the intended audience can reveal much about the message's purpose and potential biases. This differentiation in inferred audience allowed the prisoners to appreciate the media's role not just as a conveyor of information, but as a tool for targeted psychological engagement, shaping perceptions and reinforcing specific societal values depending on the intended reader. Furthermore, the prisoners started to deconstruct the visual rhetoric employed in advertisements and news photography. They analyzed the composition of images, the expressions of individuals depicted, and the symbolic elements used to convey messages. For instance, advertisements featuring soldiers often depicted them with stoic, determined expressions, reinforcing an image of unwavering resolve, while images of families emphasized warmth and unity, suggesting that the home front was a bastion of emotional stability. Building on this, however, they might have noticed a subtle shift in the portrayal of civilians over time. Early wartime imagery might have focused on women contributing to the war effort in factories, while later depictions could emphasize their role in maintaining domestic order and supporting morale, reflecting evolving societal expectations and the duration of the conflict, offering a visual timeline of civilian adaptation. Conversely, the prisoners' discussions occasionally touched upon the ethical implications of consuming enemy media. While intellectually stimulating, the act of dissecting American society through its own publications raised questions about their role as passive recipients or even unintentional participants in the enemy's information dissemination. This internal moral debate, occurring in hushed tones within the confines of the camp, highlighted the complex psychological landscape of captivity. Now, consider how this applies when you are exposed to information that challenges your deeply held convictions. It often prompts a period of introspection and ethical consideration. The newspaper, in this context, became not just a source of external information, but a catalyst for internal ethical reflection, forcing them to grapple with the moral ambiguities of their situation and their own role in processing information that originated from the very forces that held them captive. This ethical dimension added a significant layer to their analysis, revealing that their engagement with the newspaper was not purely an intellectual exercise, but also a deeply personal and morally charged one. The very act of understanding the enemy, even through their own media, necessitated a re-evaluation of their own moral compass and their position within the larger conflict. The prisoners' analytical lens, sharpened by their immersion in the enemy's printed word, began to dissect the subtle undercurrents of wartime social policy as reflected in public announcements and classified sections. Beyond the overt war news, they identified recurring notices pertaining to rationing, salvage drives, and volunteer recruitment for auxiliary services. These weren't merely civic duties. They represented a national mobilization strategy, an attempt to integrate the civilian populace into the war effort by fostering a sense of shared responsibility and contribution. Now consider how this applies when you observe widespread public campaigns for specific causes. They often reveal underlying societal priorities and governmental strategies for collective action. The consistent presence of these announcements suggested a deliberate effort to cultivate a citizenry actively engaged in the war, not just as passive observers, but as participants in its logistical and material support. This detailed analysis allowed them to understand the war not just as a military conflict, but as a total societal undertaking that permeated civilian life, influencing even the most mundane aspects of daily existence and demonstrating a comprehensive approach to wartime management that extended far beyond the battlefield. Furthermore, the prisoners noticed how the language used in these public service announcements often employed a carefully calibrated blend of urgency and reassurance. Phrases emphasizing sacrifices for victory were frequently paired with assurances of eventual triumph and the protection of democratic ideals. This rhetorical strategy aimed to motivate citizens by appealing to both their sense of duty and their hope for a better future, creating a carefully managed psychological environment. Building on this, however, they might have observed how specific demographic groups were targeted with tailored messages. For instance, announcements appealing to women for volunteer work might emphasize their crucial role in supporting the troops or maintaining home front stability, while messages aimed at younger men, if not eligible for direct combat, might focus on industrial production or essential services. This demographic-specific messaging revealed a sophisticated understanding of societal segmentation in wartime communication, demonstrating how the state sought to harness the potential of every segment of the population through targeted appeals and defined roles, thereby maximizing collective effort and minimizing dissent or apathy. Conversely, the prisoners began to interpret the absence of certain topics in the newspapers as equally significant to their presence. A noticeable lack of detailed reporting on civilian casualties from enemy bombings, or a consistent downplaying of the economic hardships faced by certain segments of the population, suggested a deliberate editorial policy aimed at managing public perception and preventing widespread demoralization. Now, consider how this applies when you notice what isn't being discussed in public forums. The silences can often be as revealing as the pronouncements. This selective reporting, this curation of information, indicated a conscious effort to maintain a narrative of progress and resilience, even in the face of significant challenges. The newspaper, therefore, became a document not only of what was communicated, but also of what was deliberately omitted, offering insights into the strategic communication efforts designed to shape public opinion and sustain national morale throughout the protracted conflict. This critical examination of omissions allowed for a more comprehensive understanding of the information control mechanisms at play, revealing the sophisticated methods employed to construct and maintain a desired public narrative, even when that narrative diverged from the full spectrum of wartime realities. The prisoners' analysis of the newspaper's advertising content evolved to discern subtle societal anxieties that the war effort, or perhaps the very nature of conflict, amplified. They began to notice a rise in advertisements for life insurance policies and robust financial planning services. This wasn't merely about opportunistic marketing. It suggested a widespread public consciousness of mortality and financial precarity, a tacit acknowledgement that the war's reach extended beyond the battlefield, impacting the economic security and future prospects of families on the home front. Now consider how this applies when you observe an increase in certain types of professional services advertised during uncertain times. It often reflects underlying societal concerns about stability and risk mitigation. These advertisements, placed alongside articles about troop deployments or battlefield victories, created a layered narrative, indicating that while the nation rallied for war, individual concerns about personal safety and financial well-being remained potent, shaping consumer behavior and underscoring a complex interplay between national duty and personal prudence. Furthermore, the prisoners began to interpret the placement and frequency of certain advertisements as indicators of societal priorities. Advertisements for luxury goods, while still present, might have been relegated to less prominent positions or appeared less frequently, suggesting a societal shift towards more utilitarian consumption or a conscious effort to avoid appearing ostentatious during wartime. Conversely, the increased visibility of advertisements for war bonds or civil defense services pointed towards a deliberate strategy to channel public resources and attention towards the war effort. Building on this, however, they might have observed how even seemingly frivolous advertisements, like those for new entertainment or fashion, were subtly reframed to align with wartime themes, perhaps by featuring models in patriotic attire or by emphasizing how these products offered a much-needed morale boost during difficult times, demonstrating a pervasive integration of wartime messaging across all sectors of commercial activity. Conversely, the prisoners' discussions sometimes delved into the psychological impact of aspirational advertising during a period of scarcity and deprivation. While they themselves faced extreme limitations, seeing advertisements for goods and services that represented comfort, convenience, and abundance offered a peculiar form of vicarious experience. This could be a source of both frustration and a strange form of connection, reminding them of the world they had lost and the values that defined it. Now consider how this applies when you encounter media that depicts lifestyles vastly different from your own. It can evoke a range of emotions, from longing to a critical assessment of societal values. The newspaper, in this context, acted as a window into a world that, while engaged in conflict, was still striving to maintain and project an image of prosperity and normalcy, a complex duality that offered fertile ground for their ongoing analysis of the enemy's societal fabric and the psychological underpinnings of their wartime resilience. This multifaceted engagement with advertising revealed not just commercial strategies, but also the deeper societal aspirations and anxieties that shaped civilian life during the conflict. The prisoners' engagement with the newspaper evolved beyond mere information gathering. It became an unintentional study in the subtle art of wartime propaganda, specifically how it aimed to shape perceptions of the enemy's resilience and technological prowess. They observed how articles detailing advancements in aircraft production or naval engineering were often presented with a fanfare that bordered on the celebratory, even when juxtaposed with reports of battlefield setbacks. This emphasis on industrial might and innovation served a dual purpose: to bolster domestic morale by showcasing national strength and to project an image of unassailable superiority to the enemy. Now consider how this applies when you encounter news that seems disproportionately focused on technological achievements during a period of conflict. It often reflects a strategic effort to project an image of dominance and inevitable victory. The prisoners, analyzing these reports, began to understand that the narrative of technological supremacy was as crucial a weapon as any physical armament, designed to demoralize the opposition and inspire unwavering faith in their own nation's capacity to prevail. Furthermore, the prisoners began to discern a pattern in the reporting of civilian contributions to the war effort. Beyond the overt calls for volunteerism or war bond purchases, they noticed articles highlighting the ingenuity of factory workers, the dedication of nurses, and the sacrifices of families managing on rations. These human interest stories, while seemingly anecdotal, served a vital function in humanizing the abstract concept of national mobilization. They demonstrated that the war effort was not solely the domain of soldiers and generals, but a collective endeavor that relied on the commitment and resilience of ordinary citizens. Building on this, however, they might have noticed how these stories often emphasized themes of stoicism, perseverance, and unwavering patriotism, presenting a carefully curated image of a unified and determined populace, effectively masking any underlying dissent or widespread hardship that might have undermined the national resolve. This detailed examination of narrative framing allowed them to appreciate the sophisticated psychological operations embedded within seemingly straightforward news reporting. Conversely, the prisoners' discussions sometimes turned to the ethical implications of interpreting information designed to influence their own perceptions, even indirectly. While their primary goal was to understand the enemy, they recognized that the very act of analyzing wartime propaganda required a critical detachment that was difficult to maintain. They pondered whether their detailed dissection of American media was in some way contributing to the enemy's psychological warfare, by internalizing their narratives, even if critically. Now consider how this applies when you're exposed to persuasive messaging that seems designed to elicit a specific emotional response. It prompts a reflection on your own susceptibility and the potential for unintentional influence. The newspaper, in this context, became a complex battlefield of information, where the prisoners, despite their adversarial position, were compelled to engage with the enemy's carefully constructed narratives, forcing them to constantly reevaluate their own analytical frameworks and the psychological impact of sustained exposure to such pervasive messaging. This ongoing ethical and psychological self-assessment was an integral, though often unspoken, part of their wartime experience, revealing the profound and often insidious ways that information warfare could permeate even the most isolated of circumstances. The newspaper was not merely paper and ink, it was a vector of influence, demanding constant vigilance and a sophisticated understanding of its manipulative potential. Reflecting on this journey so far, we've navigated through the intricate tapestry of human interaction that unfolded against the stark backdrop of global conflict. The threads we've followed, though originating from a singular, almost improbable moment, have unraveled into a complex exploration of perception, adaptation, and the enduring echoes of empathy. It's as if we've been examining the multifaceted facets of a single, remarkable gemstone, each angle revealing a new depth, a previously unseen luminescence hinting at the core brilliance within. The initial flicker of disbelief that greeted the premise has, through careful examination, illuminated the profound complexities that lie beneath the surface of historical events, demonstrating how the seemingly insignificant can often hold the most potent keys to understanding the human condition. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider how the convergence of individual choices and broader societal currents creates a powerful, often unexpected dynamic. The narratives we've encountered, the subtle shifts in communication, and the quiet affirmations of shared humanity all contribute to a cumulative understanding that transcends simple historical accounts. It's akin to observing the gradual formation of a landscape, where countless individual raindrops, each seemingly inconsequential, collectively shape the contours of valleys and the majesty of mountains. The insights gleaned from these forgotten fronts are not isolated observations, but interconnected elements that contribute to a richer, more nuanced appreciation of the forces that shape our collective past, and by extension, our present. The path forward towards a conclusive understanding is thus paved with these interwoven observations, each contributing to a more profound grasp of the enduring human spirit. In light of these insights, the journey we've undertaken compels us to consider the lasting resonance of moments that defy easy categorization. The way information was disseminated, received, and interpreted, the subtle interplay between official narratives and lived experiences, and the unexpected avenues through which human connection could manifest, all these elements coalesce to paint a picture of remarkable adaptability and resilience. The cumulative effect of these explorations suggests a deeper truth about our shared history, one that is not solely defined by overt conflict, but also by the persistent, often quiet, currents of human behavior that persist and evolve, even in the most challenging of circumstances. As we move towards our final contemplation, these synthesized threads prepare us for a conclusive understanding that acknowledges the profound impact of these often overlooked dimensions of human experience. The biting wind that swept across those forgotten fronts carried more than just the chill of winter. It carried the faint echoes of human resilience, a testament to the enduring spirit that persists even when buried beneath layers of conflict and neglect. We began with a scene that defied the stark realities of war, German prisoners of war, confined and dispossessed, receiving Christmas gifts from American girls, their presents wrapped in the very newsprint that chronicled their nation's struggle. This improbable juxtaposition was not merely an anomaly, it was a profound paradox, a quiet revelation that the boundaries of animosity could be, however fleetingly, bridged by an act of unexpected grace. The newspaper, initially a symbol of their confinement and the enemy's narrative, transformed into a tangible link, a conduit for shared humanity that transcended the barbed wire and the battle lines. Our journey through this forgotten front was not a simple recounting of an unusual event, but a deep dive into the intricate currents of human experience that flow beneath the surface of grand historical narratives. We witnessed how the prisoners, compelled by an innate need to comprehend their stark reality, meticulously unfolded those newsprint wrappers, not just for the war reports, but for the glimpses of everyday life they contained. Advertisements for consumer goods, stories of community resilience, and even the subtle visual language of societal aspiration offered them a complex, humanized portrait of their adversaries. This was not merely about information gathering, it was about a profound act of cultural decoding, a testament to the human intellect's capacity to seek understanding even in the most adversarial of circumstances. The newspaper, in its unassuming form, became a repository of these nuanced observations, a silent narrator of the complex interplay between conflict, information, and the persistent human desire for connection. What emerged from this meticulous examination was a powerful understanding that history is not solely written in the grand pronouncements of leaders or the decisive strokes of military campaigns. It is also etched in the quiet gestures, the unexpected acts of kindness, and the profound capacity for empathy that can surface even in the darkest of times. The newspaper, in its unassuming presence, became a symbol of this duality, a chronicler of war and a vessel for peace, a tool of propaganda and a canvas for shared human experience. It demonstrated that even when nations are locked in conflict, the fundamental human drive to connect, to understand, and to offer solace can find unexpected avenues of expression. The stories of these prisoners, their meticulous analysis of the newsprint, and the simple act of receiving gifts wrapped in the enemy's words serve as a poignant reminder that the most profound lessons of history often lie not in the roar of cannons, but in the quiet whispers of shared humanity. The true practice of understanding history, of truly learning from it, begins now, in recognizing these subtle yet powerful echoes of our collective